to come up. It'll be up in a minute. I finally got the page up. Okay, let me get the chat out so that I can pop out the chat and follow that. All right, good evening, everyone. And my name is Skip Conover, and we are beginning a new season of the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group. And we are, over the next probably year, we're going to be working on this book, which is 2 essays on analytical psychology, which Dr. Jung wrote and rewrote for like 25 years. And so we're going to try to get a context of that over time. And so I'm going to start with a share, which is the back cover of this book. And let me get it on my screen. And here it comes. And this is why we're doing it. Okay, so 2 essays on analytical psychology. This is volume 7 of the Collected Works of C.G. Jung. And here's what it says. This volume has become known as perhaps the best introduction to Jung's work. In these famous essays, The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious and On Psychology of the Unconscious, he presented the essential core of his system. Historically, they mark the end of Jung's intimate association with Freud and sum up his attempt to integrate the psychological schools of Freud and Adler into a comprehensive framework. This is the first paperback publication of this key work in its revised and augmented second edition of 1966. The earliest versions of the 2 essays, one from New Paths in Psychology, 1912, and The Structure of the Unconscious, 1916, discovered among Jung's posthumous papers, are published in an appendix to show the development of Jung's thought in later versions. As an aid to study, the index has been comprehensively expanded. This book must be considered a fundamental work among Jung's writings and deserves to be read by Jungians and non-Jungians alike, according to the American Journal of Psychotherapy. Another blurb here is, this work is important as evidence of the evolution of Jung's thought. The book contains the original essays, which were written in 1912 and 1916, as well as their most recent revisions, and is valuable as an introduction to the analytical or complex psychology of the Jungian school, according to Thomas J.J. Althusser, the Journal of Religion. And one more blurb. The 2 essays on analytical psychology deals with central concepts. The inclusion of the original drafts of the essays was a sound idea, and to compare these with the current version conveys vividly a sense of ideas in growth, according to Stuart Prince, the Journal of Analytical Psychotherapy. Okay, so I'll take that off the screen and see. Okay, all right. So one of the very interesting things about this book is that there are 5 prefaces that have been written for the different editions. And I want to read each preface and have a comment on the 5 prefaces. They obviously are written at quite different dates, and they're separated by up to a decade. And they definitely show the different issues that were coming up in the 20th century for developmental psychology and analytical psychology. And so I'm going to read the first preface, which is, I don't know if it's the longest one, but it is a page and a half. I'm going to read that first, and then we'll discuss that. And I look forward to your comments. And good evening, Art, and good evening, just in case. Welcome. So here's a preface to the first edition, 1917. This essay is the result of my attempt to revise, at the publisher's request, the paper which appeared in the Rascher Yearbook for 1912 under the title New Bahnen der Psychologie. Sorry, I don't read German very well. The psychology of the unconscious processes. The present work thus reproduces and that earlier essay, though in altered and enlarged form. In my earlier paper, I confined myself to the exposition of one essential aspect of the psychological views inaugurated by Freud. The manifold and important changes which recent years have brought in the psychology of the unconscious have compelled me to broaden considerably the framework of my earlier paper. On the one hand, a number of passages on Freud were shortened, while on the other hand, Adler's psychology was taken into account. And so far as was possible within the limits of this essay, a general survey of my own views was given. I must warn the reader at the outset that we will be dealing with a study which, on account of its rather complicated subject matter, will make considerable demands on his patience and attention. Nor can I associate this work with the idea that it is in any sense conclusive or adequately convincing. This requirement could be met only by comprehensive scientific treatises on each separate problem touched upon in the essay. The reader who wishes to probe more deeply into the questions at issue must therefore be referred to the specialist literature. My intention is simply to give a broad survey of the most recent views on the nature and psychology of the unconscious. I regard the problem of the unconscious as so important and so topical that it would, in my opinion, be a great loss if this question, which touches each one of us so closely, were to disappear from the orbit of the educated lay public by being banished to some inaccessible technical journal, there to lead a shadowy paper existence on the shelves of libraries, which is, of course, exactly what happened. The psychological concomitants of the present war. Of course, this was written in 1916, and so he's talking right in the middle of World War I. The psychological concomitants of the present war, above all, the incredible brutalization of public opinion, the mutual slanderings and unprecedented fury of destruction, the monstrous flood of lies, the man's incapacity to call a halt to the bloody demon, are uniquely fitted to force upon the attention of every thinking person the problem of the chaotic unconscious, which slumbers uneasily beneath the ordered world of consciousness. This war has pitilessly revealed that to civilized man that he is still a barbarian, and has at the same time shown what an iron scourge lies in store for him if ever again he should be tempted to make his neighbor responsible for his own evil qualities. The psychology of the individual is reflected in the psychology of the nation. What the nation does is done also by each individual. And so long as the individual continues to do it, the nation will do likewise. Only a change in the attitude of the individual can initiate a change in the psychology of the nation. The great problems of humanity were never yet solved by general laws, but only through regeneration of the attitudes of individuals. If ever there was a time when self-reflection was the absolute necessity, let's try that again. If ever there was a time when self-reflection was the absolute necessary and only right thing, it is now in our present catastrophe. It is now in our present catastrophic epoch. Yet whosoever reflects upon himself is bound to strike upon the frontiers of the unconscious, which contains what above all else he needs to know. Signed, Kuznets, Zurich, December 1916, C.G. Jung. Okay, so that's preface number 1. Comments?
Yeah, I quite enjoy how already at the end of this first preface, I mean, there's kind of, in some way, like a psychological call to personal arms. And it's also really interesting how there's this curious thread of, which I think you see in a lot of other places in Jung's work, where he's not necessarily making a distinction between the individual and the collective, or subject and object, or at least not any clear distinction. It's almost like he would rather collapse those categories into themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting in terms of the prefaces. I took this quote down from L.Doctorow that seemed to apply to what Jung was doing at base. And the quote is, "When ideas go unexamined and unchallenged for a long enough time, they become mythological and very, very powerful. They create conformity, they intimidate." And what's interesting is Jung is driving in to those cultural and societal blind spots that L.Doctorow was talking about. And like you said, Skip, I mean, that's exactly what happened. They drove into clinical psychology, B.F. Skinner on the surface, when he was really the CIA manipulator man. And what's interesting to me is 2 primary ways to motivate people are inspiration or manipulation. And of course, B.F. Skinner did the manipulation part, but I think there's a bigger piece where Jung is going further than those 2 expected manipulation, inspiration modes to make the gesture towards societal clarity of vision, and where it's, don't look at the good and the bad, look at what is actually here in the dignity of difference between us, and that creates connection with powerful listening. Yeah. And that's what Jung was all about. And it was almost presaging when he said, this to be relegated to a shelf, etc. And then that's exactly what happened, which was, to me, very saddening. But I think the culture as a whole, there weren't enough individuals ready to say yes, and they were more ready to be led, more like sheep.
But Jordan, what you're talking about is exactly that piece about these papers, these records, these interpretive documents being locked away. The reason I was in Maryland is because I was going to spend a day at the Library of Congress. Mm-hmm. And I was invited by the Library of Congress because they said, if you're interested in this person, which is my aunt, so she's not alive anymore, but she's still very much flesh and blood to me because she's part of my flesh and blood and because we spend so much time together, then you're going to need to access these papers that we have. They invited me, they prepared the papers. And so I am experiencing, and just today I had a long phone call with the Bancroft Library at Berkeley about the same thing, because Library of Congress sent me to the Berkeley people and they said, you need to go there, you need to talk to those people. So this is, there are some of us who have to do the legwork. We have to do, and I think that's what, the 4 of us I see on the screen, That's what we're doing.
Yes. Yeah, we are doing
And
the
our
legwork.
place in our lives, I'm sure this isn't the only place where we're doing this legwork. Just like I'm doing this legwork about my aunt, I'm going to those libraries, these repositories. It's our responsibility.
It is.
Yeah. Right. And that brings up something that this first preface was an early echo of, which is what I consider to be the most important paragraph in Man and His Symbols. Okay, I've read it many times. Man and His Symbols, which Dr. Jung, late in his life, in the early 50s, had a dream which suggested to him that he needed to prepare something that was accessible to laymen. And I find this particular paragraph most important. And there were certainly references, or this is a later echo of what he said in that preface. As any change must begin somewhere, it is the single individual who will experience it and carry it through. The change must indeed begin with an individual. It might be any one of us. Nobody can afford to look around and to wait for somebody else to do what he is loath to do himself. But since nobody seems to know what to do, it might be worthwhile for each of us to ask himself whether by any chance his or her unconscious may know something that will help us. Certainly the unconscious mind seems unable to do anything useful in this respect. Man today is painfully aware of the fact that neither his great religions nor his various philosophies seem to provide him with those powerful animating ideas that would give him the security he needs to face in the face of the present condition of the world. And that quote, obviously also applied just as powerfully in 1916 as it did in 1951 or whatever this.
It does, and it actually fleshes out the responsibility concept Annabelle's bringing up. I mean, I know when I shut down my architecture firm in 2014, after realizing that my tarot and astrology were actually keeping the doors open, which one's the real job? Oh, you're a tarot reader. That's not a real job. Well, when my tarot and astrology is supporting my architecture firm, that's a total flip. So, but in terms of the responsibility Annabelle brought up, I mean, I fired architecture out the front door, but I've done it since I was 14. It's not going away. It's a mode of being piece, part of the matter for me. It wasn't more than 72 hours that it walked right back in the back door. And poetry, oil and watercolor painting, Jungian depth psychology, architecture, tarot, and astrology, et cetera, all walked in with it like a chorus. And immediately there was a responsibility to, no, I'm not a polymath anymore. I'm not a multiple expert, certainly not the jack of all trades, master of none. I was running 6 different modes of my business, 3-4 years each focusing. And then that's where the architecture of well-being came. And that's been driving my business since. And I laugh now. People say, well, you shouldn't hold yourself out as a psychologist. I said, I'm not. I'm the founder of the architectural well-being. If anyone's going to license anyone, I'm going to license them in that.
There you go.
And my expert witness walked up pretty much and said, like, no, we're not having any of this. We will barbecue opposing counsel before we even get to the mediation chamber. There is not even a leg to stand on. But Annabelle, that there was that one day in May of 2014 where it was just immediate. I had just tingles all the way through my body. It was immediately clear that I graduated from my own life experience education with all of these interests. And they were all simply, in the architectural well-being, they were all simply different ways to approach imagination. And that imagination, when you strike chords with it, would ring the dinner bell for the unconscious and well up archetypal concepts. And that breeds the heart of the matter. But going back to that responsibility, that day, my life changed. And that day, I no longer had to play those stupid reindeer games of, oh, well, I need a PhD in psychology or X, Y, or Z. It's like, no, I don't. I have a PhD in life experience, and just create. And like Skip says, so I created my own job. And, it, you know, in that day, that happened. And then there was more of a responsibility to me, to Carl Jung, because he was such a, not even so much even mentor, almost historical friend, colleague, where I felt like I dialogued. Every time I read him, I felt like I had one of those great conversations with a friend. And at the same time, he's way up here too, but he was able to communicate across at, you know, all the other mundane levels too. So Annabelle, I really
over all the other years too.
Yeah. So I
Nick,
really appreciate
did you
the
want to?
responsibility concept.
Yeah.
Annabelle, that's resonant. That's really resonant.
Nick, did you want to comment here?
Not apart from what I said at the beginning. I mean, I think that's at the heart of what we're all saying, where, you know, he's placing the responsibility on the individual, but yet again, he's not saying retreat and only just be this, engage in this kind of individualism. He's saying that's the requirement to make a contribution to the collective. So again, it's he's drawing distinction between the two. And it's so curious how that's a thread that I find also in so many other people that I read, where, I mean, there seems to be really something universal about that.
Right. And for me, when I read, well, first of all, I read Man and His Symbols in 1990 the first time, but I kept kvetching in my mind, why don't the Jungians, the Jungian analysts, you know, talk about what happens to the collective? And you know, that was something that I confronted them with many times over the next 15 years. And then I realized, oh, wait a minute, for them, it's a busman's holiday. So they're not going to go out and teach anything to we laymen, because that's their race ball. and that's the way they make their living. So they're not going to be talking about Jung in a way that makes sense to we average people, because, you know, that's what they do for a living. And for them to be on a session like this at 8:30 on Monday night would be, as I say, a busman's holiday, which is, as I have to explain it to people who don't speak English as a native language, a busman's holiday is a holiday on which the driver of the bus takes a bus to his holiday.
Right.
I have to push back on that just a little bit and say, even though it seems like, I mean, I guess you are absolutely right in saying that we're all more or less lay people. Mm-hmm. But to say that I think we're all just the average lot of people, I think is wrong. And I say that in all honesty and modesty, but, you know, mm-hmm. it's not, you know, the gas station clerk that's reading this stuff, or.
I agree with Nick.
Well, no, we aren't.
Play humble.
No, we aren't.
Well, yeah, I find there's no reason for a false sense of modesty, because I don't think we're grandstanding. I don't think we're being self-righteous. I think we're educated. We're speaking, in a sense, sermons, as it were, with Jung. I mean, pardon the pun, with the Sermons of the Dead. But you made a great point, Nick, with it. It's not the individualism, and that he sidestepped, because that would be the solipsism, and solipsistic is, you know, only the self exists. Well, that's pretty conceited, narcissistic. And then you get the nihilism philosophy, and that's pretty much just hadn't left adolescence yet, you know, all me and I'm entitled, and it's all probably really negative. He had the both and of the individual and the society at one time. And I kind of call that FICP, functionally interrelated component parts. And they they're dancing. It's a Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers kind of gig, with what he was doing. And he wasn't isolating to keep people attached to their mother and their home like Freud. I hate to always disparage Freud that way, but Freud wanted lifelong clients and wanted to keep them in his own stuff. Jung didn't want you as a lifelong client. He wanted you to teach you the art of living. And then,
let's save Freud until we get into the psychoanalysis chapter, which comes up first.
I'll probably mute my expletives in that one. So
okay, well, I
but
do want
it comes at a point where Jung is not disparaging Freud entirely yet.
And that's I love the word yet. But then when he started to, he left it. He didn't disparage Freud. He basically, the oak tree cracked out of the seed, and he became the Carl Jung we know. And he didn't hop around psychologically, politically disparaging Freud very long. There was just the rumble of the birth, that four-wheel drive of birth is messy. A seed cracking open is like an incendiary explosion. And so he didn't waste that trouble, but he didn't stay there very long. He got back into the Jung garden and started naturalizing that.
It's interesting. I was just reading about this in the Manual of Zen Buddhism, which is part of Marie-Louise von Franz's book, Alchemy. And there's an image of, in Japanese, we would call him Hote, who's a wise old fat old man, the happiness Buddha, sometimes people call him. And he's talking to a younger person under a tree. And there's a caption here which is worth reading. Entering the city with bliss-bestowing hands, the last of the 10 ox-herding pictures of Zen Buddhism represents the culmination of the process of individuation. And now having moved, quote, and now having moved through the stage of emptiness, and also having seen God in the world of nature, the individual can see God in the world of men. Enlightened mingling in the marketplace with wine bibbers and butchers, publicans and sinners, he recognizes the inner light of Buddha nature in everyone. He doesn't need to hold himself aloof, nor to be weighted down by a sense of duty or responsibility, nor to follow a set pattern of the set patterns of a holy man, nor to imitate the past. He is so in harmony with life that he is content to be inconspicuous, to be an instrument, not a leader. He simply does what seems to him natural. But though in the marketplace he seems to be an ordinary man, something happens to the people among whom he mingles. They too become part of the harmony of the universe. That was part of Suzuki's Manual on Zen Buddhism.
That's beautiful in regards to that Jungian both and.
Right. And so, in 2016, I sort of had given up on getting any Jungian analysts to talk about this to layman people like I perceive myself to be, and also never to talk about the collective. And that really ripped me, I have to say, because the one thing I wanted people to talk about was the collective and the impact of these ideas on what happens and happened over the 20th century. And basically nobody has properly done it yet. And I'm not saying I'm doing it, I'm saying that it needs to be done.
It's interesting, Skip, that you were ripped. I felt ripped too when I had my Interstate Highways TV show, internet TV show. I had 10, 12 young analysts over a couple of years on, and everything would go fine. We're talking about the individual. We're talking about general, and I would say vague topics. And it was great conversation until I would bring up, well, how does that general piece and the individual apply to the individual of the society or the culture? And I mean, just crickets. And I have to end up asking some other question just to jumpstart the show, so I don't have to fire myself for 2 or 3 seconds of dead air. But that they would not, and it's actually, it wasn't they would not understand and respond. It's that you could tell they didn't have a consistent educated scholarship over decades to respond to that pond. And so I have to say, no offense to them, but I was ripped too, because I felt like, wow, you guys are working with Jung, but you're not applying it except with your private sessions. How does that work?
How does it help society at all?
Yeah, it doesn't.
And Jung had this perspective, which I don't agree with him about having, because he didn't bring forth what he knew, especially between the wars. He could have done, and he didn't. And I think he had a father complex. He was conflicted between Freud and his father, basically, between psychology and religion. And he just didn't want to be in the middle of a battle. So he left it to us to do the battle.
He gave us all the ordnance, but then he left.
Right. So what I would say is, since 2016, well, first of all, in 2015, I tried to find a Jungian analyst to work with, because there's a sort of a rule in Jungian analysis that you should have an analyst of your own. And, whenever I would hear James Hillman or other people talk, the first thing that they would say is, I'm James Hillman and my analyst is so-and-so. Okay. And so I said, okay, so let me go find an analyst. So I tried to do that in 2015. And the analyst I approached said, I'm afraid of you. I can't analyze you because I'm afraid of you. You know more than I do.
They would be analyzing a professional. And so you were asking them to enter into the who reads the reader, who analyzes the analyzer. I mean,
right.
And that's terrifying to some people, because not all psychologists are even in the group who are qualified to analyze the analysts.
Yeah. And so then over this 5-year period that I've been doing this reading group, I've certainly learned a lot more than I knew at that time, a lot more, and especially how it connects in with religion. And it's every bit as important to me now as it was then, and more so. And so, I take my cue from that paragraph from Jung where he says you can't expect someone else to do something you're loath to do yourself. So I started to do it. And what started to happen was that I started to get more and more respect among Jungian analysts who said, what you're doing is great, keep doing it, right? Without too much of a discussion beyond that. And so I have kept doing it, and I am keeping doing it. And, for the YouTube audience, I would urge you to listen to this book that I'm currently reading into the YouTube channel, Alchemy by Marie-Louise von Franz. It is a profound book, absolutely profound. And so far I've gotten through the first 2 of 9 lectures. And this is why I can't talk anymore. And I found the 5th and 6th lectures decapitating. They're so powerful. And so I haven't read those yet into the system, but I will do over the next 3 or 4 weeks before I have my surgery. So let's
question really quick.
Really
yeah,
quick.
go ahead.
To speak directly to that, where you are garnering more and more respect. They're kind of Red Rover, let the analysts come over, speaks to what Annabelle was saying too, about what all 4 of us here tonight are doing in the world. And in a sense, we're rototilling the garden to give a lot of the silo a place to bleed out and grow into society. But from a liability standpoint, errors and omissions insurance, and just general respectability with their papers in various journals, it's dangerous to them to do that because those are career killers. Except that we're creating whole lifetimes of careers around what ostensibly someone might call me a hobbyist psychology person. It's not a hobbyist psychologist. I'm not going to say I'm a psychologist. I have to, watch that word, but I don't have to watch the other words. And the more and more I see, actually, even the last 3 weeks, I looked down yesterday, just running some accounting yesterday evening. 75% of the people who sat down at my table on this Taos Plaza were licensed Jungian analysts. And they have fast become my favorite clients because they just get it already. But then when you're giving relationship advice to a psychologist,
but they probably only dare to take it from you.
Well, I think it's funny because
they can't dare to take it from any of their peers. They have to take it from you.
Well, and there's some levity there, I think, that allowed them to open. But yeah, I looked down and I just noted. And 3 of them that were in clinical psychology and looking how to quit their job to do something they loved in psychology.
And Colleen is joining us. Terrific.
Oh, nice.
Okay, great. So I want to read the second preface here. So
yeah, before you do that, I wanted to see, since we all have the books, what would you think about each of us reading one of these prefaces?
That would be wonderful because my voice can't stand it. And
Okay.
Good evening, Colleen. Welcome. We have read the first preface of this book, and there are 5 prefaces that span 25 or more than 25 years, almost 30 years. And so we've read the first preface, which was really at the beginning of World War I. It was actually before the U.S. had entered the war. The second preface is October 1918. So it is, recall that the war ended on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. That was Armistice Day, November 11th. And so this preface was written approximately 1 month before the armistice. So since you're a volunteer, Nick, would you read the second?
Yeah, gladly.
Preface to the second edition, 1918.
All right. I'm glad that it's been the lot of this little book to pass into a second edition in so short a time, despite the difficulties it must have presented to many readers. I am letting the second edition appear unaltered, except for a few minor modifications and improvements, although I am aware that the last chapters, in particular, owing to the extraordinary difficulty and the novelty of the material, really need a discussion on a much broader basis in order to be generally understood. But a more detailed treatment of the fundamental principles there outlined would far exceed the bounds of a more or less popular presentation, so that I prefer to treat these questions with due circumstantiality in a separate work, which is now in preparation. There's a footnote recommending psychological types. From the many communications I received after the publication of the first edition, I have discovered that, even among the wider public, interest in the problems of the human psyche is very much keener than I expected. This interest may be due in no small measure to the profound shock which our consciousness sustained through the World War. The spectacle of this catastrophe threw man back upon himself by making him feel his complete impotence. It turned his gaze inwards, and, with everything rocking about him, he must needs seek something that guarantees him a hold. Too many still look outwards, some believing in the illusion of victory and of victorious power, others in treaties and laws, and others again in the overthrow of the existing order. But still too few look inwards to their own selves, and still fewer ask themselves whether the ends of human society might not best be served if each man tried to abolish the old order in himself, and to practice in his own person and in his own inward state those precepts, those victories which he preaches at every street corner, instead of always expecting things of his fellow man, expecting these things of his fellow man. Every individual needs revolution, inner division, overthrow of the existing order, and renewal, but not by forcing them upon his neighbors under the hypocritical cloak of Christian love, or the sense of social responsibility, or any of the other beautiful euphemisms for unconscious urges to personal power. Individual self-reflection, return of the individual to the ground of human nature, to his own deepest being with his individual and social destiny. Here is the beginning of a cure for that blindness which reigns at the present hour. Interest in the problem of the human psyche is a symptom of this instinctive return to oneself. It is to serve this interest that the present book was written. Kuznets, Zurich, October 1918.
Righto. So comments, welcome Colleen and Jewel.
Thank you. Sorry, I just checked, just learned that this was happening.
Okay, so we're beginning this process by reading the 5 prefaces of the book, which cover nearly a 30-year period, 28-year period, from 1916 to 25 years, I guess, 1916 to 1943. And so Nick has just read the second preface, which was October 1918, 1 month before the armistice of World War I. Any comments?
Perhaps this might be inappropriate, but I feel like Jung just threw me over his knee and spanked my butt for running in the house or something.
What? Why?
I mean, it's just, it seems like he's again just throwing the responsibility back on the individual, and just really, it's kind of a reality check. I imagine, particularly written in that time.
And we're particularly laying it on you, Nick, because you're the young one, so you have to carry it forward longer than the rest of us do.
Well, I love the way you put that, Nick, because it has never been lost on me when he says this little thing unchanged since, basically I'm going to tell you again.
Yeah. So Jewel, you raised your hand, so you should speak.
Yes, I was fascinated with hearing this young Nicholas read, but I think this young Nicholas is very much more advanced since he's been doing the tarot readings than I am.
Yeah.
And I am trying to catch up with all of you, and the part that y'all have so done for me, each of you that have heard and been with you. And this reading tonight, young one, who it was what I needed to hear.
Mm-hmm.
I have been in an environment, my life was so shaped by the family of origin that I was in, and the economic standards of that time, and with my parents' education or lack thereof, and such somewhat a sad family background, but I can say each person rose to the best that they could under the circumstances. And so for me, I speak to you is that I have been changing. And I saw that the era that I grew up in, I was going to have to need an education to do well. I knew that to have that, it was going to take a school. My mother didn't even understand how to explain to me the difference between a private college and a public college. Basically, I went against her. It took me 10 years, but I graduated with a degree in accounting. And I loved doing it. I was offered a job at a community college before I graduated with my bachelor's, offering me a job. And at that point in time, I had a young child who was not very healthy. And one of those life things happened. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But in the process of not having lots financially, I learned how to sew. And that's when, Jordan, your story made me sign in online, because I was like Colleen. I didn't find it until a few minutes ago. And Annabelle, I've listened to you in other groups too. So I feel like I'm joining the family I never had.
Well, you're welcome. And by the way, just so you know, Jewel, there is no place to enter the deep well of Jungian thought. You simply have to dive in and swim for your life.
That's a good way.
And that's why I will say to you, Skip, because of the book, and I've been blessed, I had read one of the Jungian psychologist books that was actually given to me. Didn't understand some of it, had first on. I hear the people talking in here. I hear the other people. And my background, I'm in a cult, I'll say, that is just killing me right now. So I can put that behind me. And Carl Jung's given me the way. And what I heard y'all mention about earlier with Freud, he was not the popular guy on the street at that point in time. And I'm out there to say, hey, he had all the things Freud didn't have. And it's now time to bring him to his place in history. And that's just where I am with that. So that is it. Now I want to hear the reading, and I'm putting air in my cheeks, which means I'm getting quiet.
Well, Jewel, I have to say, I love that you were listening to us, and what we were saying was basically, hey, Jewel, the water's warm. Come on in.
Yeah.
That was it. I can identify. And now I want a reading, and I want to do this, and I want to start off, and I wanted to have a book study where each person in the book group had an opportunity to read on the book. And that's what I've been looking for, and comment according to their understanding and where they were.
Right.
Nice.
And we do believe in bringing everyone along, Jewel. We also have a friend from Brazil who joined us, and she's autistic, and she was afraid that she would be overwhelmed in our advanced reading group. But I assured her now more than 2 years ago that if she came, she would be welcome, and we would bring her along as needed. And she's the first one to log on every Wednesday when we have our advanced reading group. So
well, to second that, not to even parrot it, but there's such a dignity in and of difference here.
Yes.
Where, even Jung said, thinking is difficult, so most people judge. Here, we think, we feel, we listen. And that's, to me, that's a great way, not even just to welcome, but it creates connection. And that's more important than right or wrong or good or bad. It's just listening to what the other person has. And that to me is life learning. That to me is, I won't even say it's inspirational, because that then sounds kind of quippy, clever. And it's just living and alive in that dignity of difference. So I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, I think we better let Colleen get a word in edgewise here.
Yeah.
Well, it's just that I'm slow joining, and knowing that you were doing this, And I'm not even sure what text you're using. You said volume 7 of his collected writings.
Yeah.
I don't own. Oh, that I have. Thank goodness. Okay.
2 essays on analytical psychology.
Okay, I have that. Wonderful. I do. I was listening to the reading and taking it in as best I could by just listening, and it was an astounding thing for Jung to say, and it certainly should be said again now that we're out of Afghanistan. Can we begin to look at where we are in that history as well as our own history?
Yes.
And the feelings that we might have had about it at the time that it started and the feelings we have about it now, 20 years later. So I think his message is, as usual, very timely and challenging. And I heard in the reading, instinctive return to oneself. Instinctive return to oneself. And that's that's quite a concept, that it's instinctive that we go to self-understanding. I think of it more as something that one has to decide to do and be disciplined about doing. And maybe it's because we're creatures of the culture that we've been raised in that it's difficult to think of it in terms of an instinctive return to oneself.
I love that.
That final passage was, interest in the problem of the human psyche is a symptom of this instinctive return to oneself.
Yeah.
It shares this interest that the present book was written.
And I love that, Colleen, because even like, for example, I noticed even with my clients, when about within 2 months, 2.5 months tops after March 19th, 2020, when the pandemic and the shutdowns happened, they had so much less chatter. They had so much less gossip that instinctive return to self was confusing lots of them. But some of them, they just started becoming these just blisteringly amazing people that I kind of felt the heart of the matter, but all of a sudden it just opened. And as if without the chatter, they could actually listen to themselves, and then they were magnetized and drawn in. So the instinctive return to oneself, I think I witnessed a lot of that. And it was powerful and beautiful.
Truly. And whenever it seems to me when we have trauma, we tend to instinctively return to ourselves also. I don't know if it's the cure, but whatever. Jewel, did you have another comment or question?
Just a comment. This to me is the thing that I learned about being part of the group with Carl Jung, synchronicity.
Mm-hmm.
Colleen was here, and with that, she's teaching art. One of the nights when I was listening to one of her classes, and I listened to a lot of hers, there wasn't any show in mine, and her kindness and everything let me just smile when I saw her. And back to one of the things I was saying, I learned how to sew very well. I wanted to wear clothes like those other people did.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm making draperies, and I am ready to quit doing everything. I'll be a jewel of all trades and a master of none. That's what got me here after comments and familiar faces. So thank you, each of you.
You're welcome.
Cool.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
And actually, follow up, Colleen. One of my clients said, I asked her a question, and she said, "Oh, I don't deal with that nonsense anymore. I'm the eye of my own storm." I mean, and this is someone I've been trying to draw out. And I mean, I don't deal with that nonsense anymore. I'm the eye of my own storm. And I felt like Nick said, I've been taken over her knee. Like, how dare I ask her some juvenile question like that? But that instinctive return to self, she didn't just do it. She became her own nature, and capital N nature. And it wasn't just inner nature. She was immediately doing it in her life. So that instinctive return to self is such a, well, as you said, apropos. Every time I read a quote by Jung, it's apropos to no matter where I am. I don't want to say he's timeless, but it kind of works that way.
Right. So Annabelle, you have the book, so I'm going to ask you to read the preface to the third edition, which is 1926. So it's 8 years later.
Yep. Third edition.
Yep, page 6.
1926. This book was written during the World War, and it owes its existence primarily to the psychological repercussions of that great event. Now that the war is over, the waves are beginning to subside again, but the great psychological problems that the war threw up still occupy the mind and heart of every thinking and feeling person. It is probably thanks to this that my little book has survived the post-war period and now appears in a third edition. In view of the fact that 7 years have elapsed since the publication of the first edition, I have deemed it necessary to undertake fairly extensive alterations and improvements, particularly in the chapters on types and on the unconscious. The chapter on the development of types in the analytical process, we have a footnote, but I'll keep going.
Yeah.
I have omitted entirely, as this question has since received comprehensive treatment in my book, Psychological Types, to which I must refer the interested reader. Anyone who has tried to popularize highly complicated material that is still in the process of scientific development will agree with me that this is no easy task. It is even more difficult when many of the psychological processes and problems I have to discuss here are quite unknown to most people. Much of what I say may arouse their prejudices or may appear arbitrary, but they should bear in mind that the purpose of such a book can be, at most, to give them a rough idea of its subject and to provoke thought, but not to enter into all the details of the argument. I shall be quite satisfied if my book fulfills this process. Küsnacht, Zurich, April 1925. And so the footnotes were the third edition was published in 1926 and the title was changed. I think I don't need to read that. And the second footnote was that this essay was in the collected papers on analytical psychology, second edition, and which pages those were.
Yeah. Okay. Obviously, he was struggling with the same things that we struggle with today, no doubt. And whereas he, I think, thought that as he explicated this material, it would be illuminated for the general public, it really never was. And so we really, with the exception of his new popularity, partially because of our work here, but his new popularity in terms of the people on YouTube that follow this channel and so on, the work has not yet really begun, is what I would say.
It's a developing new science.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like it lay dormant for, a century, half a century, depending. And I mean, from a gardening perspective, first year roots, second year foliage, you do a lot of deadheading, third year roots and third year fruits and flowers, fourth year, it starts to begin to naturalize. And it's as if he's had this 25-year gardening span of this coming to, now we have the Tuileries, now we have Monet's flower garden to play with. Let's get going. Like you said, Colin, it's just, here we go. And now it's time to start.
But
it's just almost, go ahead.
Excuse me, Jordan. I finished. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to say it's almost as if it took that powerful of a societal gesture that long to actually cascade through the soil of society, so it starts to poke up and naturalize in different spots.
Well, I was going to say he's turned, but psychology is about on its head, though. You know,
Mhm.
it's not just
Mhm.
it's not just the common culture that is being told something that previously that most had been unaware of, but within his own field of psychology,
Yes.
Right.
not very old at all. But all it was Freudian and Adler.
Yep.
But that's all it was. And so for him to come along and be turning that around the way he did to normalize.
Yeah, well, that was all the logos. Freud and Adler were presenting the logos, and
Yes.
he wasn't.
Well, in Colleen, you basically, I think, just to me, if I run to a larger scale, a bigger picture, you just clearly expressed that prior to 1900, the church was the primary psychotherapeutic event for all the people coming in and off the farms. And then as civilization began to bring people in closer, more dense, the individual became the church. And there's the whole chapter 5 of Ion, where, you know, it's not the second coming of JC. It's that we are each that ichthyos. We are each that Christ. And then as we connect together, there's a different community fabric that's more self-aware and also has a greater sense of feeling that I think would actually directly transform that on the farm. Most everything will kill you. You know, you have to be careful. And so now those dangers come into being able to swim the deeps of the unconscious and bring forth that fertile field.
Right, and the rules won't help you. I just want to give an example of what's been exchanged in private emails in the last few days with some of my colleagues, where one of our colleagues wanted to talk about this Marine Lieutenant Colonel who had complained about accountability, and isn't there accountability? And there is a perception that there is no accountability in what happened in Afghanistan. And as I responded to it initially, I responded by saying, well, there's accountability all up and down the chain of command, and everybody knows who's in charge and who's going to make the decision, and who has the experience to make the decision too, because who's in charge is on our shoulders and our resume is on our chest. And so we know what everybody is capable of. But there's more than that. And this is where Jung comes in, because the accountability really is in the eros, in that everyone depends on everyone else in the military, everybody. And so I remember reading at the sort of at the end of the Vietnam War, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal, and it was by a man who had been a sort of a junior Marine, like Lance Corporal or something. And he was commenting on the fact that his company commander was killed. And he said, that was the worst moment in my Vietnam tour, because I was counting on that guy to get me home alive. And the point is that people do rely on one another. And if somebody gets inflated, like a young second lieutenant who comes right out of OCS, and he's inflated and he thinks he's God's gift to the world because he's an officer and there's all these enlisted men under him, and he gets very inflated, well, that gives rise to the apocryphal story that when the shooting started in Vietnam, the average platoon commander survived 15 seconds. And that's because that inflated platoon commander had never learned that it's not the platoon commanders that run the Marine Corps. It's the sergeants. They're the backbone of the Marine Corps or any military agency, the non-commissioned officers. They're the shop foremen, if you will. And if you don't know that, you're going to end up with a bullet in the back of your head. And so, I was blessed because I was raised in the military, so I knew that long before I joined the Marines. But I definitely see that, that is an unwritten accountability, that, you are accountable as wherever you are in the pecking order to do your job and to have the proper training to do your job. And that's unwritten. It doesn't matter what the field manual says about who does what. It's, everybody under you depends on you to do your job properly, and everybody over you depends on you to do your job properly. And that's entirely unwritten. It's entirely in the arrows. And I don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think that was going on for Jung and Freud? Do you think that Jung was stepping out of line, seen as stepping out of line by coming forth with something that was really challenging everything that Freud was saying?
Well, I think yes, but I think that, that's the fundamental difference, that they were coming out of the 19th century when all the rules were very precise. Just think of Upstairs, Downstairs on television, that television series, right? It was very clear what the pecking order in Victorian England was, and the pecking order in Germany was. If you were a prince, you were a prince, and none of the serfs were going to challenge you, right? And that was all logos, and everybody believed that pecking order would hold up. And I'm sure, and Jung was raised in that culture. He was raised in the church, and the church teaches in a logos kind of way. They say, well, when you have this question, then you go to Thomas Aquinas and he has the answer, type thing. It's all pre-written. And so all you have to do is learn the pat answers, and you can be a pastor in a church, right? And that's the kvetch that Miles and I have with Paul Vanderklay, because anytime we try to question him, he goes back to the logos and says, well, this is what I learned in divinity school, and this is the way it has to be, because I'm a Christian Reformed pastor, and so I have to say it this way. And,
excuse me, could I interject something if possible?
Yeah, sure.
I think rather than interject, I want to just inject something, and I don't think it's going to overcomplicate things, but it's, it supplements your point. I think people often take for granted the influence that Kant had on Jung. And there's also something in there, both in the first preface and the second preface that seems to be a reference almost to Kant's categorical imperative.
Okay.
I have a quick quote in here, which I think is at the heart of what he's saying and what you are now saying, and I think it would do well to hear. So it says, there is therefore only one categorical imperative. It is, act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So that's very similar to what we were saying in the beginning, where Jung is not making a distinction between the individual and the collective, but saying that they exist in relationship to one another.
Right.
And he's also making this categorical imperative point. And it's
and
also
that's my point about the military accountability. That
there's one more thing before we
go ahead.
Kant was kind of a scathing social critic, and he used this term nonage in some of his writings, and it's very much the same point that I think you're making, where he was saying all of these established rules, whether it be Mosaic law or governmental law and all these things, really cause nonage. They really give this very superficial and surface level morality for people to follow that really generate moral decay more than they create upstanding individuals or anything. And it's like, again, this reliance on like reading the 10 Commandments and saying like, I can just be like this. It's pretty easy. You know, I don't have to really do much thinking about my moral code or, you know, some such thing. So
Yeah,
I
there's,
just want to add all of that to the conversation because I think that fits right in with what you're
there's
saying.
a fascinating thing that Marie-Louise von Franz says in the Q&A to lecture 5. I haven't read it into the system yet, but I have read it myself. And so she's in a conversation with a man who identifies himself as a theologian. And the remark is, I think God has already given his unique answer in each case. Okay, that's Thomas Aquinas and all that stuff. You know, I think God has already given his unique answer. And Dr. von Franz says, that is where we differ. You think God has published general rules, which he keeps himself. And we think he is a living spirit appearing in man's psyche who can always create something new. And then a remark, within the framework of what he has already published, Dr. von Franz, to a theologian, God is bound to his own books and is incapable of further publications. That is where we lock horns. But let us return. Well, anyway, so that was just an interesting exchange where the theologian believes in a dead God and the Jungians believe in a living God. Okay.
Well, yeah, and even I'm glad you brought up Kant, Nicholas, because I mean, even from Kant for Every Man, that title, I mean, he's taking philosophy out of the philosophy silo and giving it to everybody. And even that quote from E.L. Doctorow from earlier that I put out of, when ideas go unexamined and unchallenged for a long enough time, they become mythological and very, very powerful, but they create conformity and they intimidate. And so this is that introspection into those ideas that intimidate, like the church being the normal psychotherapeutic event, where this is turning that inside out. And back then, the society was the leader. So it wasn't that you were in the minority, you got carried along by the river. I mean, to your own peril if you didn't.
Well, and still true, of course.
Right. And so being a rock in the river, I mean, you can only be a rock of Gibraltar for so long until the ocean knocks you over. I mean, it is tiring. But I'm glad you brought up Kant, Nicholas, because I kind of consider him a philosophical Jung, and that he kind of punctured that silo and made it for everyone. And that's what Jung is doing as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. I listened to a talk recently from a professor who like specializes in Jung. I think that's pretty much all that he teaches. His name is Anderson Todd. If anybody wants to check him out, his courses are on YouTube. But he said in an interview, he was talking about Jung's relationship to philosophy. And he was saying that apparently Jung was quoted somewhere as saying when he was working at the, what was the mental hospital that he was working at?
The
Bergholzli.
Yeah, Bergholzli.
He was working at the Bergholzli, and people said that he would always be kind of bitching and moaning about him not having enough time to go home and read Kant in the evenings. I mean, he was designed to doing that on the weekend or something.
Right.
I mean, there's a huge influence there.
Surely, no question. And Edinger even said it explicitly. He said, we're all good Kantians. Jungians are all good Kantians, he said.
Yes.
He said that explicitly.
Well, I can imagine
very, very carefully, but I would say very much in the logoic aspect of Jungian thought, yes. But it's interesting to me too how there seems to be like this division where it's like Jung was very, very Kantian up to a certain point.
Right. So to me, Freud was simply a child of the Victorian era, which believed in, everything in its place, and, a place for everything and everything in its place. And this is how we do things and that sort of thing. Just like the theologians say, this is the Bible, you can't change it. This is what God said, and therefore that's the only word of God. Well, yeah, is that right?
Well, throughout history, the word iconoclast has been the bonehead, disparaging name for people who go against the system. And I could imagine if someone called Jung to his face an iconoclast, he might say, iconoclast? That bonehead, I would have had to care about those rules in the first place. Those are man's rules. I go by nature's rules, and the unconscious is the way that goes. I mean, he just flip and keep on moving. I don't think he would even be
when he
ripple.
wrote Psychology of the Unconscious in 1912, when he published it the first time, he knew that it would cause a split with Freud, because Freud wanted a structure, and he wanted to be the king of this structure. We can't change the sexual thing because that's my thing, and it has to be thought of this way. And
it's dark. It's only dark.
It's only dark, right? It's only dark.
And the only people to whom psychology applies to when it is dark is the very ill, the sick of mind. And so it's not for the masses. It's not for the human condition at all. It's very clinically oriented.
Right. And so, the Uniform Code of Military Justice would not keep a second lieutenant alive in battle. The only thing that would keep a second lieutenant alive in battle is that his men were relying on him, and he was relying on people senior to him. And that's all arrows. That's not written down. And yet that's the essence of the accountability that goes all the way up and down the chain of command in the U.S. military, and any military for that matter.
It's like the blood circulatory system. I mean, that's the lifeblood that moves through to keeps everyone present.
Yeah, I mean, you're trained at your level, and you better know what your job is at that level, and that's going to keep you alive. And the people that are above you are people that have more training, and therefore they're going to keep you alive. It's like the young man who said he got scared when his captain was killed because he was counting on that guy to get him home, because he had the training.
It's the law of the firemen, as we saw in 9/11.
Absolutely.
Very much so. Yeah. It's not the law of the police.
Right.
They're much more, psychologically, in testing firemen and police, they're very, very different. The police do not have that regard for authority. It's their own personal authority that they are regarded for. Where the firemen, it's not their personal authority. It's out of love. It's out of the people around them that they act. And hearing a wonderful program last night on the story of the policeman, you constantly hear, the kin pick up. When the father dies as a policeman, the son becomes a policeman. The daughter becomes a policewoman. I mean, fireman or a firewoman. Or the kids know that they've always got another family, which is the fire department. So it's all out of arrows compared to.
Sure, and the reason I joined the Marines, it was the family business. The military was the family business for me. I was raised in the military.
Well, in Colleen, the poignant piece there, but the difference between firemen and policemen, or fire people and police people, you'll see firemen in gyms, like this last week, full fire garb, oxygen tank, mask on the treadmill, and they get off, and you go, what are you doing? Did you just forget your mask today? Is that just going over the top? No. 30 minutes and 3.5 seconds, 110 floors. That's what they did on 9/11. So every year on 9/11, they're going to the gym in the full regalia, full firefighting gear, and they're running 110 floors on the treadmill in remembrance. And that's a lineage. That's a family remembering what their forebears did.
Jordan, thank you
Absolutely.
for sharing that.
Yeah,
too.
I hadn't heard that. That's an incredible one.
And I had a firefighter and a police officer when I entered my new world on each side, and they're very different.
Yeah. My uncle was a police officer, but when I saw, I mean, you know me, I'll just speak up out of turn. And I'm like, what, did you forget your mask today? What's going on? And you want to talk about me getting set on my rumpus in place. No, 110 floors, 30 minutes and 3.5 seconds. That's what they did. I sat down. I mean, I just had tingles because it's like, whoa, what did I do today? What did I do today?
And I agree. And Chip, my uncle was a military person, and my cousin died first casualties in Iraq bombing. And so my neighbor behind me came back, a fella, because I was female at that time, women weren't allowed to be, came back with one arm and no legs.
Mhm.
So this is the cycle of the military you're talking about today. And that's why I was so passionate about coming tonight. I was the female voice of didn't have the education, didn't have that, but I did it through. I see what our education system is today. I see what the military gave people, the young people today. I see what our society has taken away. I see what Carl Jung is saying. Pull that subconscious out. Baby, I'm going for it, and I have been. Y'all were just helping me celebrate it.
Yeah.
That's
Oh, boy, Jewel.
For me, I rue the day that we canceled the draft. Because when we canceled the draft, we
Me too.
limited the breadth of experience with war
Yeah.
to only a few.
For me, in my generation, you also gave up an opportunity for people to get off the farm, out of the rural, and out of their family settings. Now we've built a whole society where they're dependent upon the government. I've also lived in public housing. I've been on food stamps. Like I said, it took me 10 years to get school. That's where my passion has been, is working with the disenfranchised, is what they say today. But they need Carl Jung. They need groups like this that encompass everybody, where we're all equal and share our life experiences.
Absolutely.
It's interesting, Skip. I couldn't agree with you more. And I remember April 5th, 1991, in the middle of my thesis studio, right prior to Desert Storm. We were all of that age, and right there at the end of a 5-year program in college. And so we were all playing the tennis match in the head of, well, do I go to Canada? Do I go to war? Do I enlist? Do I go to OCS? I mean, what do I? And one night, one guy's parents had flown in and sat down, and the dad said, I was against Vietnam and I consciously went. There was a duty, except there was a society. So we just closed on a big home in Canada. Any of you want to go? We'll get you there.
Yeah.
Now, that's all I'm going to say. And he put down a bottle of wine and left. And someone's like, well, what about a corkscrew? And he said, you're about to go to war or not, you're going to have to figure out some things for yourself.
Is that what tonight's about?
But he left, and I think we all sat there for an hour just kind of muttering until we finally started talking, and all of us decided we're going to go, not to Canada. And it never happened. But that they put that in front of us, 10 o'clock at night on some probably going to be an all-nighter in the studio. And all of a sudden the whole world, they walked the whole world of responsibility in that studio. And then someone went, "Where's the goddamn corkscrew? Let's get this over with." It's like, but that piece was, we had to actually stop and get over our politics and get into ourselves and decide for each one of us, what are we going to do? And it was decided in advance of being drafted, or in advance of all of it. And it never happened, but I remember how poignant that experience was to dispense with the whole world, dispense with the responsibility. This becomes my personal responsibility to myself to do something that I'm behind, because if I'm not behind it, I will get killed. And it really was an alignment, or a harmonization, I think, of each of us with ourselves to, what are we each going to do? And I found it interesting.
But everybody has to make their own decision, right? And so I was like that. I was always against the Vietnam War from 1962, 3 years before we were officially there. I was always against the Vietnam War. And most of you know the story, so I'm not going to tell you that. But my best friend in life was the son of a 30-year man in the Navy who was staff secretary of Commander 7th Fleet. And he went to Canada, and he's still there, and he's still my best friend in life. And the reason is that his political position, and that of another friend of mine who did not serve, was correct. His position was correct. And it doesn't mean that I wouldn't have gone or wouldn't go again, because I already knew that the position of going to Vietnam was wrong, but I wanted to go and understand why it was wrong. That was one of the driving motivations for me. And I found out, and it has nothing to do with what the Chicago 7 or any of those people commented on, said, did in their demonstrations. But in the end, I had to accept my friends back into my life, because their position was actually the correct position. And so I supported the collective position and not the individual decision, I guess.
I'd like to add to that, Chip, and thank you again for what you said, because you used the words individual and collective, which to me built on what we've been talking about, what Nicholas said. And for me, you're coming back with experience, but you knew it going in. If you had not gone in and come out the way you did, you would have never been able to tell us this firsthand.
Well, I might have been dead, but
I'm saying you made a decision for you, and you've come back with the message that I read you tonight. You brought back your experience, and you still have the love of a friend who you respected their opinion, and they did what was right for them.
You want my summation about why the Vietnam War was wrong?
Yes. Yes, I do. Because I don't know the things you do.
Okay, well, when I was in Vietnam, we had something called. I
have to leave.
Oh, sorry, Pauline, but we'll see you. See you Wednesday.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be more prepared next week.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Hopefully, we'll get through the preface tonight. Okay, so why the Vietnam War was wrong, and it applies to Afghanistan even today. So while I was in Vietnam, we had something called the PACX catalog, the Pacific Exchange catalog. It was like Sears Roebuck for military people. And so you could simply fill out an order form for the PACX catalog. You could buy all kinds of things. You could buy stereo sets, China, all kinds of things. And I actually did that throughout my Vietnam experience. Whenever I got a paycheck, I would buy something at the PACX catalog and have it shipped to my then wife. And, so for her, it was like a continuing post-wedding period when she was getting all these gifts, right? But one day we had a Vietnamese woman who was probably 40 or a little older, who was cleaning up the sea hut in which we lived. And she would, sweep the floor and do whatever else we needed. I guess she took care of the laundry and other things. But one day I walked into the front area, the sea hut, the common area, and she was sitting there reading the PACX catalog. And I said, now that's wrong. Because no matter whatever happened, she could never have aspired to have anything that was in that catalog, not a thing. And so we see the same thing in Afghanistan now, where we've gone into Afghanistan for 20 years and given the Afghan people this taste of Western society, but without us, they can't have it ever. Afghan women cannot have it ever. Or, maybe they'll be able to make chips around the edges, but it's going to take a long time, hundreds of years to change that society. So anyway, that's my simple cut on why the Vietnam War was wrong. That we were trying to do something in Vietnam that we shouldn't have been doing. And the same is true in Afghanistan, clearly. So I'd like to get through these last two prefaces before we wrap up tonight.
One last piece on the Afghanistan piece too. Afghanistan being the graveyard of empires, that we pulled out may mean we aren't sucked dry. There's a double-edged sword.
We're not what?
May mean we're not sucked dry. Because Afghanistan being the graveyard of empires historically over millennia, I'm wondering now the repercussions and the after effects of not immediate, but the midterm and long term for not being there actually may be healthier for the country.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Just for that historical piece.
It's going to be painful. It's going to be painful.
Yeah, I mean, modern example, USSR, Russia, and then you can go back every 100 or so years, and Afghanistan is just, you might as well jump in a river with leeches and just not get them off. Not from the people, but from the drain on the economy and the resources that any country has entered there. It's not that it's a warring tendency to be conquered. It's the long-term drain that is more subtle, I think. So
one of the interesting. What were you saying, Nick?
I said Jung has left the room.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's bring Jung back into the room, and I don't think Joel has the book tonight, so it's up to you to read preface to the 4th edition, which was 1936.
Me?
Yes.
Okay. What do you think about lumping these last two together? Because honestly, the 4th edition does not really say that much. There aren't that many psychological points, but just some kind of...
I don't agree. It's an important point that comes up in the 4th.
Okay, so the 4th edition, 1936. Aside from a few improvements to the 4th edition, appears Aside from a few improvements, the fourth edition appears unchanged. From numerous reactions to the public, I've seen that the idea of the collective unconscious, to which I have devoted one chapter in this book, has aroused particular interest. I cannot therefore omit calling the attention of my readers to the latest issues of my Eranos Yearbook, okay, cool. Eranos Yearbook, which contain important works by various authors on this subject. The present book makes no attempt to give a comprehensive account of the full range of analytical psychology. Consequently, much is merely hinted at and some things are not mentioned at all. I hope, however, that it will continue to fulfill its modest purpose.
Yeah, and so the reason I didn't want to slough over this is because of the emphasis on the collective unconscious that had emerged in the 20 years since he published this book. And he wasn't really talking about it before. And I know that during the one of the BBC interviews, the interview asked him, well, what's your most important contribution? What do you consider uniquely yours over the history of your work? What is completely Jung and nobody else's? And his answer was, well, the collective unconscious. The recognition of the collective unconscious and that it is very real. And wow, I certainly, I experience it every day. I don't know about the rest of you, but so I think that's an important innovation.
I think so. And I think that if I go back to my gardener's metaphor example, first year roots, second year foliage, third year roots and flowers, fourth year it begins to naturalize. It's not naturalized yet. Fifth, sixth decade, and all of a sudden you start having, your riotous orange tiger lilies poking up over here. It's like, oh, I guess that's where you wanted to live. But after that, over that 20 years, the unconscious developed as the primary driving larger scale force that grew out of all his work. He had mentioned it specifically, but his work self-encapsulated just like a garden naturalizes. And I find that is even gives even more credence to his work, that his work was living, that the living God, the living divinity versus the just rote memory encyclopedic horse BS,
I think that passage from Marie-Louise von Franz is perhaps the best passage I've found in all Jungian psychology, which is the answer to the theologian, well, you believe God is dead and we don't.
And I look at her like, when I read that, I see her as Muhammad Ali, and he just goes like this, bam. I don't need to block you. I'll just move out of the way and close the distance and knock you out. And she just does that. It's like game over. Mary Louise, knockout and whatever. Marie-Louise von Franz, 1-0. It's like, yeah. Because it was deft. It was so, because she didn't bob, she didn't weave, she just kind of moved. When I read her, it reminds me of an old martial arts grandmaster. And, I was getting out of the way of the sword or this and that. And he looked at me, he said, why do you move 3 inches when the blade's only 1/4 of an inch wide? And with her, she's not even moving an eighth, she's just right there. So
yeah, she just says, that's where we differ.
Yeah.
You the theologian think that God is concretized in these previous writings and previous thoughts of these earlier theologians, and he's not. He's a living entity.
And to me, there's a concept called sprezzatura, sprezzatura, and it's a studied carelessness, but it's It's when that wit occurs right in the moment, instead of, in the elevator 20 minutes later, oh, I wish I would have said. And she reminds me of Winston Churchill's wife. And they were walking across the plaza, and she sees this street sweeper. And I think this goes to that Jungian wit and Mary Louise von Franz's wit. She goes over and talks to the street sweeper for like 25 minutes. And when she comes back, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, honey, who's that? Oh, well, we were madly in love years before we met, and we were to be married. And Winston Churchill comes back with, oh, so instead of the prime minister, you could have been married to a street sweeper. And she instantly says, honey, if I would have married him, he would have been prime minister.
Right on.
And that's that Mary Louise von Franz. Bam. I mean, she schooled the religious professional in religion just like that. So
Well, I got to say, you two fellas have brought to this 21st technology the story of how God is dead has been heard by many people without the whole story behind it, and why Winston Churchill is where he is today.
yeah.
And so we've got the technology to spread Carl Jung and his teachings worldwide. And it was what brought me here, is caused me to jump over Nietzsche in the reading I was doing to get here. So I'm catching up on Nietzsche. So I love you fellas who bring in all this other stuff in to catch me up.
Yeah, actually, you don't need to bother with the Nietzsche.
Well, from what I read recently, but they have philosophy. I don't have to, but I got to be quiet, get back to Jung.
Well, I mean,
Actually,
Jung's point about philosophy is that it's all logos. It's all based on rationality. And that's what it is. And depth psychology isn't about the logos.
It's about us, the
It's
arrows.
about us, yeah.
And actually, I brought up the sprezzatura with Winston Churchill just simply because Skips prior has brought up Winston Churchill was queried, why are you spending so much goddamn money on arts and education and museums? And he said, well, if we don't, what is it actually that we're fighting for?
Right.
He kept.
If you want the trains to run on time, we ought to have the Germans do it, right?
Yeah, exactly. We have to beat them to recruit them, so then we can keep our museums and go further.
Right. Okay, well, let's get to the 5th edition now. Annabelle, do you want to read the 5th edition preface? 1943, still 7 years more later.
Yep. Preface to the 5th edition, 1943. Since the last unchanged edition, 6 years have gone by. Hence, it seemed to me advisable to submit the present new edition of the book to a thorough revision. On this occasion, a number of inadequacies could be eliminated or improved and superfluous material deleted. A difficult and complicated matter, like the psychology of the unconscious, gives rise not only to many new insights, but to errors as well. It is still a boundless expanse of virgin territory into which we make experimental incursions, and only by going the long way round do we strike the direct road. Although I have tried to introduce as many new viewpoints as possible into the text, my readers should not expect anything like a complete survey of the fundamentals of our contemporary psychological knowledge in this domain. In this popular account, I am presenting only a few of the most essential aspects of medical psychology and also of my own researches, and this only by way of an introduction. A solid knowledge cannot be acquired except through the study of the literature on the one hand and through practical experience on the other. In particular, I would like to recommend to those readers who are desirous of gaining detailed knowledge of these matters that they should not only study the basic works of medical psychology and psychopathology, but also thoroughly digest the psychological textbooks. So doing, they will acquire the requisite knowledge of the position and general significance of medical psychology in the most direct way. From such a comparative study, the reader will be able to judge how far Freud's complaint about the, quote, unpopularity, close quote, of his psychoanalysis and my own feeling that I occupy an isolated outpost are justified. Although there have been a few notable exceptions, I do not think I exaggerate when I say that the views of modern medical psychology have still not penetrated far enough into the strongholds of academic science. New ideas, if they are not just a flash in the pan, generally require at least a generation to take root. Psychological innovations probably take much longer, since in this field, more than in any other, practically everybody sets himself up as an authority.
Okay.
Zurich, April 1942.
Yeah, and so I don't set myself up as an authority, and I don't think Jordan or Colleen do either. I'm only reading the books, but I think it's very clear that this work is, there hasn't been much change actually.
Right.
Since a century ago. And, since this, we can see the development of Jung's thought in this 25-year period, but we have to admit that most of our society has not yet rocked it. And
I agree. Yeah, I don't set myself up as an authority. I just Jungian work, concepts, etc., just simply pulse in my life experience and my work as part of its lifeblood. But it doesn't make me, master or anything. But it's interesting when he said it takes about a generation to catch on any idea, because Mark Twain said, any good idea is always a crack idea at first. Well, until it catches on, and it's the same kind of thing. But I like that Jung penned 15 years because from a family and marriage psychology perspective, 15 years is a generation.
Yeah.
It's one.
Well, that's why I'm very hopeful for Nick carrying the torch here in the future. Yeah.
Just don't carry it to the vampire's house. They don't like that.
Yeah. So Nick, thank you for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure. I mean, it's great to be with you all and hear this through the lens of your own experience.
Yeah.
I can read the books, but I'm lacking in life experience. So,
well, and Nick, I'll second what Jewel said earlier. I mean, your age here matters not.
Yes.
You have your own perspective. You're developed, and I mean, the way I look at it, for me, I'm always complete, never finished, lifelong. And you're well on that path, and you have your own bent of how you approach, and it adds such a wonderful dynamic here.
Yeah, you're so precocious is the word.
It's excellent word. Yeah, nice.
Well, thank you guys. I'm bad with compliments. I'm bad at taking compliments. So no, I genuinely mean thank you. And I'd like to move on before I blush.
Well, then that means we can throw them at you and not worry about being accurate. We'll just
okay. So one more round here. We'll see what Jewel and Annabelle have to say, and then we're going to terminate because I know Nick has to get to bed. He's going to school. So Jewel, do you want to make any further comment at all?
I like being in a diverse group with many attitudes, many personalities, and many life experiences. It makes for a good whole.
Yeah, no doubt. And no doubt. And I've learned a lot about that as well by doing these groups. I didn't know what I was doing to begin with, but I think I do know something about it now. Annabelle, go ahead.
I'm just glad we've resumed in a studious fashion and delving into deeper ideas of Jung's.
Yeah.
Barely digesting that whole span of time with the tarot and continuing with that. But I'm very excited about this. I'm very glad we got through those introductions tonight.
Yeah.
It
We're
really
also
Absolutely.
the 5 prefaces.
Yeah, 5
Yeah.
prefaces, yes.
Well, so the way this is going to proceed is we're going to read this book paragraph by paragraph. And, we may not be able, we might get through 5 or 6 or 8 paragraphs in a night, but some of Jung's paragraphs are 2.5 pages long. So,
Yeah.
So let me just mention that, okay, because Edward Edinger made a point of teaching people how Jung wrote, okay, and his point was that every paragraph that Jung writes, every one that's numbered, is a thought. It has a unique thought. It's a unique thing. And so Edward Edinger said it's like a cheese ball or
fruitcake. Yeah.
Fruitcake.
Yeah.
And that it has many aspects, but the significance of it is that it has one thought that Jung is trying to express in that one paragraph. And so you can't, he says you can't, eat Jung like candy. You have to eat them like a fruitcake, a little bit at a time, and to digest it a little bit at a time. And so this has been a 2-hour process here where we've managed to get through 5 prefaces to this book.
We just unwrapped the regifted last year's fruitcake, and
Right.
now we could start eating.
Right. And
One thing that I was very, very attracted to with this book is that while, there's probably, some grand image that Jung is trying to present his reader with, it's broken up into segments and also subsections that are pretty small. I know some of the other stuff that I've read of Jung, it's like, 500 pages and there's like 4 sections, which each are 125 pages long. And this one, at least they're loosely 10 to 15 to 20 pages. So
Yeah.
yeah, well, I think this was his early book, so he was articulating out from his early thoughts. And so, for example, psychological types emerged from this book, so much so that he had to just take it out of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at psychological types, it's about that thick. So,
Well, yeah, in this book too, he actually Younger, Younger, Younger. He was writing with psychological chunking, smaller groups of pieces. Whereas you get the longer paragraphs later, and Jung became Jung, and his psychological chunks were much larger.
yeah.
Those fruitcakes, so to speak.
Yeah. So Zen Mode here, Zen Mode YouTube says, every polyglot I read is frankly a fruitcake of nuance and complexity, but Jung especially a little of a time, or a little at a time. So I'm glad that some of you who are still online listening, and we still have 18 people that are active on YouTube, which is amazing.
Thanks for being there.
Yeah, thanks for being with us tonight. And I think it is indicative of something that many of us around the world feel is important. And I don't know where Zen Mode person is, but I know that Justin Case is in Denmark and is listening to this at like 3 or 4 in the morning.
That's a wonderful concept with Zen Mode too, because the fruitcake piece is great as a larger scale gesture, but it is that nuanced, intense subtlety that you really have to taste all the different tastes to get the whole bite of each piece. And you can't gloss over it. Oh, I get it means this. There's not a fast fascination. There is that slow boil and slow roll through all of the nuances. And even once you get them, you read back through, and then nuances turn into whole little worlds that extend out to. I mean, it's just so extensive, and I do mean to intend to extend inside and outside. I find when I read Jung, he shifts focus and redirects scale at will all the time. And if he doesn't, we can, even within the text. Right. It's so chock full. So,
right. So one other thing I just want to mention to everybody who's watching, including everybody on YouTube, is that we are getting close to having completed our organizational ideas on our confluence, which will be the 10th to the 14th of June in 2022, and it will be in Helena, Montana. And the idea of that confluence is that if you come to it, you are going to leave completely revivified, or somewhat revivified anyway, because you won't be able to think about your current problems. You're going to experience things that you couldn't possibly experience anywhere else. And Colleen Kibera is going to be there, and she has a very effective way of teaching people about their self and how to get in contact with their self. And she's going to be teaching that. And there are many other aspects. And I expect by the end of November, for sure, we're going to have a website up in which you can express interest in coming. It's going to be by invitation only. And so many of the people who will be invited are members of our advanced reading group and that sort of thing, but there will be some space for others. And so start putting it in your mind that you should be there, because it is going to be an exclusive group. It's not going to be for everybody. My instinct as a businessman is to make it open to everybody and have 200 or 300 people show up. And my colleagues resisted that very severely. And so I said, okay, all right, we're going to do it by invitation only. So there's only going to be us and our spouses plus 30 people. A large part of it is going to be at Tim Holmes' studio in Helena, Montana, which is 7,000 square feet and is filled with ghosts and spirits. I can promise you that, because I spent 2 nights there, and oh my God, I couldn't even begin to tell you. I'd have to write an encyclopedia just on that one period. I was in Helena for 33 hours, and there were 2 sleep periods, and oh my God, there were ghosts and spirits everywhere in that place. And
it sounds like I need to make sure I stay at the Nativo Lodge in Albuquerque for several days with that mural room to just warm myself up.
Maybe, yeah, maybe. Fernanda, I'm glad that you have joined us. I've invited you to join the panel, but it's a little late because I think we're about to wrap up here. But we don't have a website yet anyway, but people need to be thinking about this because it is going to be a very exclusive group. And And I wouldn't want to leave out anybody that's going to make a good contribution. You know, my expectation is that admission is going to be about $500, which will be to include some of the meals during that 4-day period. And it will include, of course, the tickets to the play that we're going to perform. And this is because I'm going to play Carl Jung in that play. So we'll see. I guess I'm going to have to get a little actor's whitening makeup for my for my mustache and maybe my my eyebrows. But
I'll just send you some hormones that it makes it grow really fast. I have no idea what happened in the last 12 days, but it hit stride. So maybe I'll just.
Yeah, but you still have a black mustache and black
it is true, right?
Too.
Yeah, it's true. I think it's growing like a tree. I think, you know, as I get older, it just kind of.
Yeah, maybe.
I guess I'll have a dark mohawk, you know, unless that's all thinned out by when I'm really a flirt.
We'll see which persona you show up for Tim's portrait.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Yeah, I just wrote that down too. I need to send the deposit and all that kind of.
I know which one I'm going to. My persona is going to be, because I'm going to be made up as
Jung. Yeah,
as Jung himself. So.
And I have to tell you, I don't know which persona, because yesterday morning, sitting here with no power, I walk in the bathroom in the mirror and I look and I went, do I really want to keep that beard? It's just one of those, it became Halloween, like a mask. And when that happens, it's usually no more than 2 weeks before it's gone. So we'll see. That's, you know, almost a year away. So
yeah. Well, that year is passing quickly, and especially for me, since I have some surgery ahead of me before that. But anyway, so we'll be here next week, and I think I might have conned Nick into leading the group on the 11th of October, which would be the first Monday after my hip replacement. So that would be helpful.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it.
Yeah. So we'll just see if I'm compos mentis enough to turn it on that night. Probably. Yeah, probably okay, because I have done 2 other hip replacements before, one ankle and one knee. And so it does pass. And so,
You said you've had 2 hip replacements before?
No, I've had a knee replacement and an ankle replacement.
Oh, okay.
And
how many hips do you have?
working your way up.
No, this is my first hip replacement, but yeah. Well, I have this handy dandy, I don't know, titanium ankle now, which works just as well as the first, better than my original ankle, which for 28 years was very problematic. But when I got it replaced, that was terrific. So anyway, peace, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Everybody.
We'll see you next time.